When we practice solitude in a regular fashion, we will discover a clarity of vision. We will see things or understand things differently. Today we're going to look at one of the more countercultural and I would say counterintuitive disciplines of the Christian faith, the discipline of solitude. When we think of solitude, we generally think of being by ourselves, being alone. And there's an epidemic of loneliness in our culture, in our world, and in our country. And perhaps some of you have struggled or are struggling with loneliness and not feeling like you have any friends, and you are around people, but you still are not connecting with people. Well, what we're talking about today is really not related to loneliness. It's rather solitude with the purpose of creating a sacred place for God to speak, work, and transform our hearts. We get this idea mostly from the life of Jesus. When he began his ministry in Mark chapter 1, it started with a frenzy of activity. He's healing people, casting out demons. He's ministering in tremendous ways. And then Mark 1:35 says, very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house where he had just healed a whole bunch of people, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. In their desperation, the disciples went looking for him, found him, and interrupted his time to say, there's people looking for you. We've got souls to save. We've got people to heal. Let's go. And then Jesus, as part of his reflection time, stated, well, we are going to go, in fact, to another town, because God has called me to preach the gospel there as well. Before choosing the 12 apostles, Jesus goes to a mountainside, Luke tells us, and spent the night in prayer as he's reflecting and connecting with God about this important decision. After feeding the 5,000, Matthew records that Jesus dismissed the crowd, went up to a mountainside by himself to pray. And we can imagine that he was considering what his ministry looks like. Is this what I've come to? Just handing out food? Thousands and thousands of people? Is this what my ministry is? And he found response from God and found strength and found purpose and clarity of vision. The last time we see him in an intense moment of solitude in prayer is in perhaps his darkest moment in Gethsemane before his crucifixion. And we find him, according to Matthew, praying to God by himself. And I guess the question, it's obvious, but at the same time, it ought to be clear to us, but sometimes we're a little bit slow on the take. If Jesus, the Son of God, who had an ongoing 24/7 connection with God, needed to separate himself from his ministry and his world and his culture to silence the noise of his culture, if Jesus needed that, how much more do we in today's world with our distance from God and the amount of noise that we live with? The world is a noisy place. Many of us, from the time we wake up, the radio is on, we're listening to talk radio, we're listening to music, we're listening to a sermon, we're listening to something, watching it on the TV. Some of us even sleep with noise all night long. I have a little machine in our bedroom that it produces white noise. So my life actually gets quiet when I wake up. The desert, the isolated place, has long been a place of refuge for God's people. Moses was in the desert when God spoke to him through this burning bush. When Moses went to Egypt to rescue the people, the call that God gave him to tell Pharaoh, let my people go. We want to go 3 days into the desert, the middle of the desert, so that we can worship God. That's where we need to be, 3 days away from the noise of Egypt, so that we can find God. It wasn't in a desert, but it was on a mountainside all by himself that Elijah, in his depression and desperation and frustration and his willingness just to give it all up, found and heard God's voice. But it wasn't in the earthquake. It wasn't in the lightning. It wasn't in the big, big movements of God, but rather in the soft, quiet whisper of God's voice. The Apostle Paul, after his conversion, he spent 3 years in Arabia, where we understand that he was being prepared by God in solitude for this upcoming mission of reaching the Gentiles. In the celebration of discipline, Richard Foster makes the distinction: loneliness is an inner emptiness. Solitude and the discipline of solitude is actually inner fulfillment. Solitude is not escaping or running away from responsibilities or things going on in our life. It's not an isolation that then breeds either self-pity or a false pride that we're so holy that we can do this. It's definitely not a punishment. A lot of times people look at silence as a punishment. Schools, if the kids are acting up during lunch hour, the punishment is you can't speak during lunch. Silent lunch. And so sometimes silence can be viewed as a punishment, and that's not what we're talking here. And it's obviously not something reserved for monks and mystics who live in deserts or on top of a mountain. True spiritual solitude is a call to God for us to intentionally withdraw from the world and the noise of the world so that we can find and hear the voice of God and have spiritual communion with Him. Sacred silence allows us to hear God's voice. We empty ourselves of the distractions so that we can be filled with His presence, and we create a space for God to do His transforming work. Some of you maybe have even done this or have seen a potter working with a piece of clay on the wheel. If that clay is not in the exact center of that wheel, it's going to spin kind of out of whack. And then also part of the task of the potter is to mold that clay, but part of what he or she is doing is pushing out and forcing out all the air bubbles so that it can truly be a solid piece of clay. Well, getting away and being centered in God is kind of like what the potter is doing for our lives. It's the way that we kind of get back on track and get back to our default. Whenever my computer gets a little wonky or my cell phone isn't responding, I had an issue for a while where I would speak to my phone using that word. I'm not going to say it because my phone will, I fixed it and now my phone will answer, but S-I-R-I, I hope she doesn't know how to spell. And it wasn't working. And so that's how I send texts when I'm driving and receive texts, and it wasn't working. And whenever something goes wonky with my phone, my computer, my TV, what do? Turn it off, wait 10 seconds, and turn it back on. 9 out of 10 times that resolves the issue. That's always, for me, my first step. Well, finding and hearing that sacred call to being alone with God is kind of that turning it off and turning it back on. When we practice solitude in a regular fashion, we will discover a clarity of vision. We will see things or understand things differently. I spoke Friday night for the VBS, the last night of the VBS at the Gateway Church, and I was struggling to find an illustration from my life that would fit in that particular lesson. And so I turned off the radio. I pulled over in my car when I was driving from work on Thursday, and I pulled over and I just sat there for a minute and I thought and I reflected and I prayed. And then in the silence of that moment, I remembered, it was about rescue. I was rescued off of a mountain when my dad took me up on the mountain to teach me how to ski. You know, there's only 2 things you really need to be able to ski, a right leg and a left leg. Well, I don't have a left leg. It was a bad idea. And they had to call the ski patrol, and I was rescued from that mountain and taken directly to an ambulance that took me to a hospital for surgery. But it took me being quiet and centering and listening. And then God reminded me of how I needed to be rescued at that particular moment. And so we do get that clarity of vision. It's a time when God can speak to our heart and we can feel his love and his forgiveness in very intimate kinds of ways. It is a time when we can gather spiritual strength and feel fortified for the battle, whatever we have coming before us. And I think for our world today, one of the biggest benefits is it's a time for us to be free from this performance society that we live in. It's a time for me to say, I don't have to produce anything. I can just sit here and spend time with God, and I can just be in the presence of God without thinking about doing. Now, if you've never done silence as a discipline, don't sign up for a week-long spiritual retreat where no one speaks to you and you do not speak to anyone. It might be a little bit overwhelming. So start short and start in small chunks. Maybe 15 minutes or so per day. Kids, you might want to try 5 minutes of just sitting at a table, just sitting in a chair, nothing on, and just sitting and just thinking. It sounds daunting, and it will be initially. Some people find it helpful to have a specific place in their heart, in their house or in their yard where they sit. You know, the King James, it goes, when Jesus was giving instruction about prayer, he said, go into your prayer closet. Well, go into an inner room, go to a specific place, sit in that particular chair and use that as a moment. And once you're there, you begin by preparing your heart. You can begin with confession. You can ask God to cleanse your heart. You can surrender your day timer, your phone, your clock. If you're going to put up the phone, take off your watch as well, because that is also part of the ongoing noise that we feel constantly. We can use Scripture, but you don't really have to read Scripture. It's just really reflecting and being with God. This is not an academic time. A friend of mine went on a week retreat of silence when he was in Memphis, when we were in Memphis, and he took a whole stack of books. And he said, man, this is going to be great study time. And he was preparing to write a thesis, and so he just took all those books, and the priest that met him said, what do you think you're doing? And he says, well, I'm getting down the books I'm going to want for the study. He said, no. You're not going to study anything. The only book you're allowed is the Bible. And he says, okay, well, can I at least phone a friend? No, give me your phone. In fact, right now, this conversation is the last conversation you're going to have with anybody, the last person you're going to see for 5 days. Now, how does that strike terror in your heart? He survived, and he said it was the most amazing experience that he had. But you have to get over that fear. Some of the obstacles or objections or situations that occur, the first, my mind just races and it won't stop. Well, that happens to us all. We've got a lot on our mind and we can't go to sleep, and it's just we're thinking and working over and hashing about our next day and all the things that we have going on. And there's little memory, there's relaxation techniques that you can use. If you're interested, give me a call or come by the office. I'll be happy to discuss some of those. But don't fight those thoughts. Your mind is your mind. Get out a piece of paper, start writing it all down, and then put it away. And then just kind of focus on trying to get back to why you're there. Second, some people will say they don't hear anything, that I was going to be there from 12 to 1, and I was waiting, and God didn't show up, and now I don't have any time for him, and so he lost his chance. Well, you don't always hear everything that you want, and you don't always get the message that you're looking for. And part of faith is trusting God even in those moments of silence when we think that God's not working. Often, he is working the hardest in our life. And then probably the biggest obstacle or challenge for me and many of you, I would assume, I feel guilty about just wasting time. I could be doing something useful. I could be doing something productive. I could be sending emails or texts or working on this or working on that. Our culture worships busyness, and God values being over doing. And one of the ways that our culture has tied us into this addiction are these little machines. It's like an umbilical cord that's connected to us. And not only for phone calls and texts, but emails and social media and news feeds and streaming entertainment. You can watch TikTok or whatever the latest streaming device or platform is, YouTube, 24/7. And so we have to be intentional about shutting it down and shutting it off. I remember in our home when we had the phone on the wall, we made it a practice of not answering the phone during meals. It just rang. It's okay. It can ring. If it's important, they'll call back. Maybe you can make one of those kinds of rules in your home. More and more restaurants are requiring people to give up their cell phones during a meal. Put them in a little box. You can pick it up afterwards, but don't use your cell phone to be calling or receiving calls during the meals. It's almost a Sabbath, as it were, from this constant distraction and noise. Science Magazine recorded an experiment they did. They asked people to sit in a room, blank room, nothing on the walls, a chair and a table, just themselves, for 15 minutes to be alone with their thoughts. 15 minutes. If they couldn't handle being alone with no stimuli, there was a button they could push that would give them an electric shock. Care to guess the percentage of people that chose the button? And repeatedly, 65%. Preferred to get a shock rather than being alone with their thoughts. Because we are addicted. We are addicted and we need to go through withdrawal. God is calling each one of us into this sacred place of solitude, not as punishment, but as a privilege. He wants to be and He wants to commune with us. So this week, set aside 15 minutes a day. Kids, try 5 minutes where you're just sitting at a table, no distractions, and it's just you, your thoughts, your mind. You might start by saying the prayer that Eli taught Samuel, Lord, your servant is listening. Speak to me. It will feel awkward, especially if you've never done this before. You can think on Psalm 46:10, be still and know that I am God. You can think about this prayer, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. And think about all of the ways God has forgiven you and all the forgiveness He is pouring over you and pouring through you. The Scriptures promise us if we draw near to God, what happens? He will draw near to us. This is an opportunity to enter into that sacred place, to hear that call. And I'll be thinking about you this week. You can send me a text and let me know how you're doing. And if I don't respond, it might be because I'm in my spiritual place and I'm getting strength for my day. But we can share our stories and we can share how God is working.